Okay, it looks like we are good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and throw the link out. And once you guys get in there, just let me know if everything's looking okay, if everything's working as intended. No worries. Looks good? Okay. Then I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Going to move my setup around a little bit. Ah. Okay. I think we're ready. Feel free to interrupt me at any time for any reason. And here we go. So to kick us off, why don't Omega? Why don't you go ahead and start? What do you have for me in the way of questions, or if you'd like to see me try and demonstrate something? So tips on anatomy. Okay. Yeah. So obviously, I can't tell you everything you need to know about drawing any sort of creature or figure. But hang on, I'm getting feedback from somewhere. Is that from one of you guys? Or yeah, it's from Rena. Okay. Sorry, not to pick on you. I was just curious what was happening. So how to study anatomy? I think what you need to do is first of all know that you don't need to know everything, right? It's not necessary to know all the bones and things like that. I mean, the more you know, the better you'll be. But I think most people aren't necessarily interested in illustration, right? You're depicting the reality of something. You're sort of more interested in stylizing things, right? So I'll go ahead and just draw a figure, and I'll try to talk about what I'm doing as I go. So first things first. Like all drawing, you're trying to start from simple and go to the more complex, right? And anatomy is the same way. So when I start a figure, I'm just trying to place the overall. I'm not even worrying about proportions right away. Usually, I don't do this, but I think this is helpful sometimes. Once I have a pose imagined in my head, so like I'm gonna do a character sitting down with maybe like a leg up from the side. So I'm gonna try and draw like a box around where I think they're gonna go, and that will help me start to think of the overall placement of things. I think once you have this, it's a lot easier to say, okay, well then maybe the torso should be here and the hips should be down here, and so then the legs are going to go here, things like that. Having that overall sort of boxy shape, I think, is a great way to start. So for this figure, I've got the shape down, and I think what I'm going to do next is a gesture. And that's kind of the next level of complexity, where you're not necessarily planning any specifics other than the energy of it, the overall flow. You'll see some artists who have a really good sense of energy, and when you look at the piece, you can imagine how the character's supposed to be moving. A lot of where that energy comes from is the gesture. And gesture just refers to these sort of quick lines that you're using to describe, like I said, the flow of the piece, there's a lot to learn about gesture, but I think the best way to learn it is just by practicing, because a lot of it's not stuff you can necessarily explain. When it does, there is one thing I can think of though about gesture that is easy to say. S curves are a good time. S curves meaning this sort of like back and forth type shape, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a full S, obviously. But let's say I want to gesture a figure that's standing, and so I'll say, okay, there's my line. Or maybe I'll make it more complex and I'll add a second line somewhere in there. What that means is, as I'm starting to place the bigger masses, the bigger forms on the body, I'll try to keep them in line with this the best I can, and that'll help me maintain a flow to the piece. So when I look at this line, I didn't actually have a figure in mind, but I can imagine maybe the head being here and the torso being over here. So maybe they're facing this direction, and maybe their hips are down here. And so maybe we've got maybe we've got one of their legs is like this. The other one's like this, so maybe they're like falling forward sort of. So then maybe I'll add their arms on. Maybe they're like coming out to catch themselves or something like that. But you can see when I take away those. Oh, no, you can't, because I did it on the wrong layer. That's another good tip. Don't do things on the wrong layer. I'm always doing that. That's so frustrating. So I'll do it again real quick, and maybe I'll try something different. So maybe there's a head and some hips and a torso, and maybe the legs are doing something like this. So maybe it's like a weird running pose, like a really dynamic situation, right? And torso, get the arms pumping. So this is a weird weird as hell pose, but once I take that line away, you can still sort of see that overall energy. And if I was going to start trying to like actually flesh this out more, even once I start adding in more of the forms and more of the actual line work, it still maintains that energy. So that's what gesture is all about. And we're just going to go ahead and get rid of all of that because it's garbage. So with this form here, this figure I was going to talk about earlier, my gesture might be something like that. And you can see, even though the lines are very simple, you can start to kind of imagine what's going on here. So we might imagine this line here is a leg that's bent, and maybe here's the face looking down and the curve of the back. That's kind of your next step, is this sort of gesture. Luckily, there's a really easy way to practice gesture. Go to pixellovely.com, and I have spent many an hour just watching the slideshow of figures and trying to as quickly as I can, work out a gesture. And they have some good advice on their site as well about gesturing. So I highly recommend that. I'll put a link down in the description of the video when I'm done. So next step, and again, feel free to interrupt me because I'm going to ramble for a while. So I think the next step for us past the gesture is going to be placing the major forms. So following my gesture, I know I want my head to be here, and I want my torso to be here, and maybe my hips to be down here. And you see this a lot, right? Where when you're trying to learn and you're looking up tutorials, you see people saying, oh, it's easy. You just make a head and a torso and the hips, and you put them on a line. But something's missing from that explanation, right? I think what's missing that most people don't get right away is that these are actually in a particular proportion already. Like, we're already diving into anatomy when we're doing this three circle setup. And you read like how to draw whatever books, And they're typically awful because they tell you, oh, we'll just make the shapes. And you don't know how to make the shapes. Like, there's so many questions to be had just with this already. Even if I take away all this. Even if you just start by trying to place 3 circles without any other preparation, how far should these be from each other? Should they all be the same size? You know, things like that. How far can you make this stuff curve before it stops making sense? Like, if I stick, you know, everything really close together like that, does that still make sense? Maybe, but maybe not. So in order to get to this stage, what you'll want to do is spend time looking at simplified forms. If you can't find any, I mean, I know there's some like Renaissance drawings that you can find. I'll see if I can find the names of them, where you'll find artists are just using really cubic forms to describe figures in preparation for a bigger piece. So you might see something like this, where, you know, you've got the perspective on it. Try to find stuff like that, right? And then try to copy it. That's how I got to where I am with the circles, is just by trying to look at pictures of people or even these simplified forms, ideally. I think that's kind of easier to work with mentally. And try to copy it as best you can. And you won't get it right initially. You're going to keep messing it up, but that's okay. Go ahead and just keep doing it. And when you start to get it right, then what you can do is stop and try to do a full drawing, try to do a full piece, and see if you can get it right there. And keep repeating that process until you consistently do it correctly. That would be my recommendation. And that's really how you should practice kind of all drawing. Like, to get to this point with these guys, I had to spend a lot of time looking at pictures and being like, okay, there's a head, there's a torso, there's some hips, right? Just 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Keep doing that until it starts to look right. And if it doesn't look right, maybe take a second and think, why doesn't that look right? But the reason I'm talking about this box and the gesture is because they help. And so even while you're practicing, you can kind of practice all 3 of those things at the same time if you feel comfortable doing that. If not, just do one at a time until you have it down. You know, do a shape, and that's okay. Just leave it like that. You know, that's like the simplest form of practice I know, is just make a shape. It just gets you making lines on paper. If that's where you're at, that's okay. It's a fine place to start. If you feel up for it, though, make a more complex shape and then add a gesture to it, and try to, you know, because the shape itself has a gesture too. So I might like throw one of these in and say, okay, now that I have a gesture and an overall shape that's going to contain my figure, now I have to figure out how does this guy fit in here. So then I might say, okay, so then here's my head, here's my torso, here are my hips, and then just kind of work on trying to place things. Like maybe the leg goes here, maybe the other leg is here, got some arms, right? Keep doing that, and it sucks. This is like the hard part of drawing, and this is the part that nobody likes. But the more you practice that kind of stuff, the easier it becomes. And once you don't have to think about it anymore, you get to a point where you can just do what you meant to do, and that's the greatest feeling in the world. That's why you practice. Okay, I'm going to stop talking for a while and just try to do this. But please let me know when you have questions. So I've got those 3 forms there. I'm just going to go ahead and add some really simple lines for the limbs and where I expect the feet might be. And again, the proportions on these are things that I've worked out in my head. They're not perfect necessarily, but they're things I've practiced enough that I kind of have a sense for them. So then I'll try to figure out just really basic, where do the arms go? Maybe over here is one, maybe another one is coming down and then resting on the knee, something like that. And this is like the really, really simple version of what we're of trying to assemble an anatomy, right? When you start to flesh things out, as it were, you're essentially trying to work from a plan you've already created. In this case, I've already got a schematic almost, and I can start trying to add, forms to say, okay, so there's where my hand's going to be. There's an elbow, things like that. These overall shapes, again, come mostly from observation. So a big part of learning anatomy is just looking at bodies. Something about just staring at bodies for long enough gives you a better sense of what's happening. Like, for instance, when I was practicing gestures and trying to draw figures over top of them, eventually I got to a point where I could really consistently sort of lay down what felt like a rib shape, and then a middle, and then a waist on top of or a waist and then like some hips on top of my gesture. And that became the anchor point for the rest of my drawings. So even today, as I doodle or sketch or whatever, a lot of times I will just not even bother with any of this circle stuff and just lay down like a ribs and a back, and just sort of from my imagination where all these things ought to be. And that's kind of where you want to end up in one of those situations where you can just sort of lay stuff down and not have to think about it. That's when you start getting to a point where you can sort of express your creativity, which is, I think, probably what everyone ultimately wants out of drawing. But so that's the schematics aspect of it, right? All this work is mostly for the sake of helping you memorize the overall proportions of things, like how long should this line be, how long should this line be. Doing this from a photo reference, following this pattern of basic shape to gesture to circles to stick figure, right? That's how you're going to start teaching yourself the overall proportions. Then once you're past that point, you can actually study anatomy. And I don't mean to say that don't ever study anatomy until you've done this, because I certainly didn't. I think it does make it harder for you, because, like, you might know that the collarbone, works like this, and it wraps around, and then it attaches to the top of the shoulder. And so then there's the shoulder blades that come down the back like this. And, you can know all these little fiddly details, but they don't help you if you can't do this. If you can't place them in the right spot, then they're useless to you. So I would highly recommend you spend a lot of time doing this. So go to Pixel Lovely or any sort of similar, reference slideshow type site, or even if you have a collection of reference. I find having it pre-timed out for you, so it forces you to be fast, is better. But do whatever works. Practice making shapes and then gestures and then placing forms inside the gesture. Once you feel comfortable, you can drop the shapes, for instance, and just go from gesture to forms. And then once you're really, really comfortable doing this stuff and it's becoming quicker, you can challenge yourself again by taking the gesture out and just trying to place forms correctly on the first time. Those are my recommendations when it comes to anatomy. So that was a lot. That was a lot to say. I'm sure it was a lot to hear. Helpful? Okay. What other questions do you have about that specifically? Before we move on to something else, about that specifically, because like I said, I covered a lot of stuff just there, and I want to see what else there is. I'm sure there's something I missed. Not for you? How about anybody else? Yeah, actually, I can think of something that I missed. So I told you everything to do to get ready to study for anatomy, but I kind of assumed that you hadn't done that, mostly because I didn't do it until later, and that's not a good assumption to make. I will talk about how to study anatomy as well. So just like everything else, you got to practice. And the way you practice is by doing it over and over and over again. And every time you do it, try to make a slight, subtle change and get it right that time. So, for instance, when I was trying to learn how to draw heads, I would, whip down a circle, and then I'd, be like, okay, so then maybe here's a jawline, right? I'm like, well, something about that doesn't look right. So then I whip down a circle, and I try to add a jawline. And I say, okay, well, maybe that's closer, right? But I don't like this area. This looks weird to me. So throw down a circle, lay down a jawline. Okay, well, now my proportions are wrong again, so let's try that. Lay down a circle, put down a jawline. No, nope, not quite. Lay down a circle, put down a jawline. So you keep doing it over and over and over again until you nail one aspect of it, and then move on to working on something else. But you keep doing the same thing, because otherwise you're going to have a really hard time telling when you're making progress. So that's how to practice this stuff. But actually studying anatomy, you have a couple options. Psychra is a cool artist who does a bunch of guides and stuff online, and I'll go ahead and link him as well. He has a neat figure that's sort of in his style, and he breaks it down into these overall parts where he sort of highlights, like, okay, so if this is the head, the front of the face is kind of like this, and there's the jaw sort of works something like this, and then the ear gets placed over yonder, top of the head sort of flattens, back of the head's got this stuff going on. He sort of covers all of that, and he simplifies it into one graphic, and I really like that. So I'll also put that in the description so you guys can find it. But that's ultimately the knowledge you want to have. Take a look at that and just remember, that's ultimately what you want to have in your head. To get there, you have options for what to study. I personally studied photographic reference of just bodies, whether that was flayed bodies, like, dissected. I found that to be really helpful. The issue there is it grosses some people out. If you're really not comfortable with that, then don't do it. Don't feel like you have to be good at art. Definitely push your boundaries, experience new things, but if that really just isn't cool with you, then you can also just draw over top photographs. That's another great way to do it. So get a photograph into your, if you're doing digital, that's cool. That's easy. Or print it off. And then try to erase a lot of the picture if you can. Keep it in black and white and just sort of rub it out if possible. And then take some bright colored pencils, like some reds, and try to look at an anatomy guide or another reference that shows you where the muscles should be, and then try to draw where they are under the skin, right? And eventually you'll get to a point where you're let's say you're drawing an arm. You'll say, okay, so the bicep roughly shaped like this, and it sort of comes over and around, does one of these guys, and then the deltoid comes over the top and sort of inserts over here, and it's like this big sort of overlapping shape. Contour lines, I didn't mention that. Contour lines are actually, I think, really helpful when it comes to learning anatomy too. So lines that sort of describe the overall curvature of a shape, or a 3D object rather. That can help a lot too. And so then we've got, tricep, and that's sort of doing this kind of thing over here. And then that all connects to this elbow, and we know the bone shows up through the skin over here. And then you've got the lower half of the arm where you've got these two bones that sort of do this kind of crazy thing. And on top of that, we've got, what do we have? we've got some muscles and some bones and crap. Obviously, you don't have to remember every single piece. Like I said, you'll get to a point where you're just sort of remembering overall shapes. Like when I go to draw an arm, I'm not thinking about all this stuff necessarily. I'm thinking about what position is it in, and I kind of have an instinct for what shapes show up. So if this is my arm and hand is down here, I'm just like, yep, I got one of these going on. And then there's the elbow situation, and then I got this. And if it's in this position, there's not as much muscle on that side. So, like one of those. I'm just sort of winging it like that. And most of the time, you can wing it, and it's not a big deal, especially if you're doing a more stylized look. So, like I said, when you're studying and you're starting to get to this point where you can sort of, without having to look at a reference, imagine where all the muscles are. That's pretty much good enough. The overall shapes is really all you're going for. Like memorizing the exact shape of the bones, for instance, not always necessary. Some of the really important ones that are close to the skin, you could pay attention to those. For instance, the collarbone is pretty important, and it can help if you're having issues with like your torsos feeling kind of flat. The collarbone does this neat thing where it comes over and around and meets on top of the shoulder. So that can help you sort of make a more 3D situation. Bottom of the ribs is a big one. That shows up through the skin quite a bit. Hips. You should probably know what's going on with the hips. They've got, you can kind of think about them as like these two major plates, because underneath you've got basically like a big circle of bone, and then it meets here in the front, in your like pubic area, right? And then you've got this big hole where all your junk hangs out. And you've got the two little doodads on the bottom where your hip connects to your leg bones. So like these two crests right here, as they're called, the iliac crests, stick straight through your skin. And in most people, heavier people not as much, but like, so you should know kind of roughly how those hang out. Your leg bones do a weird thing where they come out and away from the hips, and then they sort of bend back in. This part tends to stick out too. So, again, knowing what's up with that. But other little bones, like how does the coccyx fuse to the back of this shit? Like, no, you just don't need to know that. But I'll also throw down some book recommendations in the description. The Atlas of Human Anatomy for the Artist, I believe it's called, really helped me. It's got some great illustrations there. That's mostly a reference, but for when I'm actually drawing and I need something to look at right now, the Cycra's diagram, I really like that, so I'll throw that in there as well. Excuse me. Okay, so that's anatomy. I'm going to take a quick break here and get something to drink and read some text messages. Can somebody throw out the next topic we want to cover? Or if something about that last topic wasn't clear, go ahead and let me know. Or if you want to see more demonstrations, if I should do more drawings, let me know. I can do that too. I see there were some questions in the chat. Yeah, go ahead and interrupt me, guys, because obviously, as you've just seen, I will keep talking forever. I seriously will. So please let me know. Had a question about muscles and fat deposits. Muscles, yeah. So the thing about the body, right? It kind of sucks that we as humans are so obsessed with drawing each other, because human bodies are like mega tricky and full of weird curves that are not consistent at all. So part of the difficulty I think beginners run into especially is that if you actually look at human bodies, they just don't match up to anything. Here, I'll go ahead and I have a really cool picture. I'll see if I can find it. And you guys might want this too. it's a big long picture full of different bodies of different athletes, and sort of the different shapes they end up having. And I think that's super cool to look at. Yeah, here we go. So that should be in the stream, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in real good. I'll start at the top. There we go. So, of course, I don't know exactly how much of all this you can see. I hope this comes through clear, but let me know if you're having a hard time making that out. Looks good? Cool. So as you can see from this, like, there, even just from this one section here, there's just such a massive variety in human bodies. Height, width, all the proportions are subject to change. This water polo guy, for instance, super lean. You can see, let's see if I can get a brighter color coming through here. You can see where his hips and his muscles separate, right? So he's got this huge, thick layer of muscles over top of his core because he does all that swimming. Meanwhile, his chest, his pectorals, are pretty minute. And then back here on his shoulders and his arms, of course, they're massive again, right? You can clearly identify each muscle group in his arm because he used them so much to get around in the water. Meanwhile, Miss Figure Skater over here is really lean. She's really light. She's got really not that much muscle definition, especially in her core, compared to Mr. Water Polo. Her arms are relatively thin. Her legs are pretty lean too, especially for a female. That's probably partly just due to her personal body proportion. But you can see, like, if I draw just a straight up she's twisting slightly, so this doesn't exactly work, but her shoulders and her hips about the same width. Her hips are even slightly smaller. If she put them down at her side, they would be closer. Meanwhile, you look at like Hockey Bro here. His shoulders are all the way out here due to his thicker deltoid muscles, and his hips are way in here, right? He's got this nice big V situation going on, which is what you want when you're a handsome man. You want that V situation. V is where it's at. So yeah, right. The question is, like, how do you reconcile all this stuff, right? How do you keep this shit in mind? Well, the good news is that everybody is fundamentally the same as far as the pattern goes, right? It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are or what your body shape is like. The pattern is always going to be the same. So when it comes to learning muscles, stick to learning groups, right? You can do the breakdown of stuff like arms, right, where they're going to stick out. But on a person like this, right, if you were going to draw a character that's thinner and leaner, you can't find the muscle groups in here. You still need to know them. But when you go to draw them, there's only the slightest indication of where they are, right? We don't see a separation between the deltoid and the tricep and the bicep, but we know it's there. And if we're trying to draw and we just try to pretend that her arm is a tube, right, that doesn't quite look right. I mean, for some styles that are very, very cartoony, that's kind of okay. But if you're going to be studying muscles, stick to groups, big groups. So like deltoid is a big group. Tricep, pretty big group. Bicep group. The muscles on the arms, there's two main ones there, but you can sort of get away with just knowing what's happening on the inside, because this is a more noticeable muscle group, and then the rest of the arm tends to be pretty straight. It depends on the position, obviously. Like Hockey Guy here, you can see both groups showing up, and that it's got this bulge down here and it's got this bulge up here, and then we've got the rest of the arm sort of relatively straight. But look at like Peyton Manning, even then there's still differences. Peyton Manning has got crazy forearms. Like, just wrist to forearm proportion is bananas on that guy. So overall groups, like I said, the Psychro diagram that I mentioned is great because he just highlights these big groups. Instead of breaking down all the muscles of the core, for instance, right? Because there's a lot of them. He just sort of says, you got your ribs, and you've got the muscles that sit on top of them, and you've got the pecs. That's all you need to know about, right? And for most cases, yes, that is all you need to know about. So when you're studying, stick to groups. As you get familiar with those groups, go ahead and learn more, because learning more will help you, especially if you like drawing particular proportions, or if you like particularly muscular figures. There's a lot to know. But overall, yeah, stick to the big groups. Like on the thigh, you've got that guy, this inside muscle. You've got this big one that comes across the top. And then, Oops. And they meet on top of the knee, right? That's pretty much all you need to know. So keep it simple. Fat was the other part of that question, if I recall. Okay, here we go. Wrestling guy is a great example. Oh, we got 2 wrestling guys. Even better. So when you draw somebody who's fat, I don't do it that much because I just don't like drawing thicker people with a lot of fat on them. It's just personal preference, just not something I'm interested in. But I would say you're going to do all the same stuff, and then there's sort of a pattern to how males and females accumulate fat on their bodies. Once you know the patterns, you can sort of do the same thing with muscles, where you can stretch them out. Like you've got, Barbados Slim over here, this basketball guy. This muscle on his back is there on all these people. But do you want to emphasize it or no? Right? So once you know all those big muscle groups, it's up to you to decide where you're going to put the emphasis. Same thing with the fat, right? Males collect fat right here. And that's about it. All the way around their back. That's why you hear the phrase spare tire, because they get it on their sides. They get the love handles. They get it on the bottom of their stomachs areas. So over here, typically. I'm sorry. They get a fupa. Yeah, that's right. And they get a little bit on their backs too, but not that much. So if you want to draw a fat guy, pretty much you're going to focus on this area, right? If you want to draw a fat female, she's going to typically gather it in, let me think about that, her hips. So the hips will get wider. At their widest point, typically, they'll get thicker. You do see some in the tummy, but it tends to be not as much, and mostly in their ass. We don't have a good, I don't know that we have a good shot of somebody's bum in this particular image. I'm guessing they're all facing forward. I'll take a quick look. Nope. Okay. No such luck, but butts is definitely going to be the other big area where we're going to see fat accumulation on women. It's all buns and thighs, man. If we look at this individual, for instance, over here on the right, we can see he's gathering it on his sides, and it's sort of forming this kind of drooping shape over here. And that is what's up with the dudes. And then we had a heavier female down here. Yeah, you can see she's got it in her tummy a little bit because she is a much larger person. But a lot of it's showing up here in her thighs. Even though she's quite fit and we can see so much definition in her legs, there's also this sort of layer going on here too. Like if we want to compare her with the gymnastics person to her, to her right, our right even. The thigh muscles are still there, but we almost can't see where they start. I bet if she was naked, we would see probably like a crease right here between her stomach and her thighs. And that's part of why fat is tricky, is it hides things. Even once you know your anatomy, it can be hard to find this stuff. And probably in her crotch as well, there's probably quite a bit of fat accumulation there. But typically, if you had to sum it up, both males and females wear it like a girdle, and then they gather it elsewhere. Secondarily. So a really, really obese person, or whatever you want to call that, will start to see it in their face. They'll start to see it in their hands. Sometimes on women, you see it they get the bingo wing situation, as it's called, on their underarm, under their triceps. You'll have that. So that's where it shows up. How to draw it? Luckily, fat kind of just does its own thing. So most of the time you can get away with guessing. Just remember that gravity plays a big part of it, especially with breasts. Some women, I know not all, but some women will gather it in their breasts as well. And just remember that gravity does things to heavy stuff. So the chest will typically sag. If you were going to look at it from the side, you see on like younger, thinner females, typically the breasts and the nipples sort of point upwards almost. On a heavier person, they will tend to pull downwards more. So you add more mass to that situation, and you get like a crease on the bottom typically, where it's pressing down into the flesh underneath it. The nipple sometimes can go weird directions, like sometimes it'll drift to the side or it'll be pushed farther down. Looking at pictures of people is always the best place to get this information as far as what are the variations, where do you see those changes happening. But those are overall what I notice about people as far as where they gather fat. So, what did I miss about that? Okay, well, let me know if anyone has further questions about that. What's that? Okay. Kelp asked about where the curves go. I sort of talked about that. I could try to demonstrate real quick. I'm not warmed up yet, so I'll warn you, I'm off my game. But let's say I'm going to draw a like a hip and a torso situation. Where do the curves go, right? Again, knowing the muscle groups is the biggest thing. But they can kind of go wherever you like, is maybe the short version of that answer, right? It depends on how you want to draw them. Like, for instance, I've gotten into the habit recently of drawing my figures with really long, elongated hips because it makes it look better when I add ridiculously wide thighs on them, right? So then I can add these crazy proportions where, internally there's a logic between the torso and the hips. So I might say, okay, well, I've got a waist going on down here, and that all looks kind of normal. And then I can add super exaggerated thighs if I want to, right? This is even too much for me, but but just so you can see what I'm talking about, right? You can get these really crazy shapes going on. So curves, yeah. I know that's not necessarily a super helpful answer, that they can just go where they want, or where you want them to. But once you know the muscles, like I said, it gets easier to just say, I want to emphasize the fat deposits on the hips, or even just the muscles on the hips. I want to make those crazy, right? So, just going to go ahead and doodle for a bit, and whenever we have new questions coming in, Omega, you've been super helpful. Thank you. If you just want to let me know. Okay. What's up? How much experience do I have with backgrounds? So, personally, I've only ever really drawn figures and people. That's kind of my MO. I have attempted to do landscapes in the past. All I could really explain to somebody about how to do landscapes and backgrounds and things would be if you're going abstract, I could offer some color theory. I could talk about composition, actually, because that's a big part of what makes a background a background. If it's not a landscape piece where it's specifically about the landscape you're looking at and it's meant to just be background to something else, typically what I would think to do is, first of all, you got to know what's going on with your scene. So let's say we're doing like a comic panel. And I know that my character action is... Let me think. Maybe we've got a gray even. Maybe we've got like a person over here. And... let's see what else might be going on in this scene. Maybe it's a fight, so we've got like this character over here, and then further in the distance we've got another character who's, you know, getting ready to fight as well. Yeah, as you can see, I'm not exactly taking my time with this or anything. Um, so, a background, right, is meant to help emphasize the foreground a lot of times. At least that's sort of what I would think to do. Especially with comic panels where they tend to be quite small, you don't have that much real estate to make stuff happen. If you're doing a more static piece, maybe you can spend more time on the background. But if I've got these two figures here who are gonna be fighting, for instance, my overall flow is it's like this, right? We've got the top of their heads that kind of line up, the bottom of their figures sort of come down in this wide angle here. And the overall flow is you're gonna, you know, look probably from left to right at this guy and then this guy. So we go like 1, 2, right? And that tells you the story of the picture. There's two guys, and they're going to fight. We see this guy's in a stance, this guy's in a stance. So your background, in order to make that obvious, make that show up, you kind of want to respect this angle. So if I was going to make a background to this piece, I might place the horizon line in agreement with these two figures. So I might place it like here. Oops. Go over here maybe to get like some extreme perspective going on, or I might put them at if they're like at the top of a building, for instance. This could be the edge of that building, and then over here is more buildings, you know, like a skyline situation. All that good stuff. Or we, you know, depending on how tall the building is, maybe it's just sky over here. But that would be a good way to respect that. And then this, I could just leave blank. Your circumstances sort of dictate what your excuses are, but the overall composition of the thing should sort of remain the same. Like, let's say they're in a jungle. Well, then maybe it's not the edge of a building, but maybe it's a river. So maybe I'm just going to like snake a little creek or a river over here, and that just takes up the whole top corner, right? And sort of comes off here into the distance. Something like that. You know, utilize what would make sense to exist there in that situation. If I needed something over in this corner, for instance, to really amp up the energy, To really reinforce that angle, I might do something like, if there's like a table over here, for instance. Trying to figure out the angle on that. It's confusing my brain for some reason. There we go. Something like that. I might throw in like a table over here. You see what I'm saying? That it agrees with that angle that we drew out earlier. It reinforces the overall flow of the action. So when it comes to backgrounds, that's kind of the advice I can offer, is that make sure the foreground is being re-emphasized by what's going on in the background. But as far as like trees and how to draw that shit, I have no freaking clue. I once tried to draw a bush and it didn't work out for me. So I never tried to draw anything but people ever again. Okay, Kitty has a question as well. What is up? Yeah, no, I'm going to answer questions that relate to specifically the art stream that I'm doing right now. But thanks. Shading, that's right. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I had totally forgotten. So, do you have a more specific question about shading or just in general? In general? Okay. So the way I learned shading, I'll start with that. The way I learned shading was by practicing drawing 3D objects. So I had already spent quite a bit of time doing that, trying to, draw things like spheres. Oh, okay, awesome. Thank you, Jiggy, if you're in the voice. If not, somebody please tell him thank you. Cool. Yeah, so I had sort of already spent time drawing 3D objects and trying to like figure out how do I make those look right, and cones and spheres and half spheres and stuff like that. How do I make that stuff work? What's the general construction technique? Things like that. Shading is sort of the next step from that. If you don't already have a good handle on drawing 3D forms, I would not recommend you do too much in the way of studying complex, real-life-esque shading. You can usually get away with basic shading. Like, for instance, I see a lot of times, like, cell shading type stuff, like for animation. Basically, all you're doing is, like, throwing down an area of color, right? And I could just do one of these, where you're approximating the overall shading because the actual information that you would be displaying otherwise is not important, right? And that's kind of what art boils down to a lot of times, is what am I trying to say and how am I going to say it? And you can't say everything, just like a book. You know, it's not worth it to describe every facet of what's going on in a scene. You know, how many bugs were in the air and what did the fair smell like? I mean, maybe, right? But otherwise, you can sound like Stephanie Meyer, where you're just putting in weird details that don't help. So it depends on what you're doing. So keep that in mind. If you're like me and you just draw figures, then the amount of shading you do is pretty minimal, generally, because your primary interest is in portraying a human body. And what you want to say about that body typically does not involve really, really carefully cultivated light and shadow. Although sometimes it does. Some people, and you look at like Renaissance work, right, where the shading is immaculate. They're saying something very specific about the body insofar as reality is beautiful, right? The tangible is what matters and is beautiful and worth paying attention to. And the art was sort of in service to the reality of a thing. That's sort of the message, but then of course they're exaggerating in some ways and simplifying in others. So That's part of why I don't do that, because I don't really agree with that concept. But enough about all that crap. Basic shading boils down to, on any given 3D form, you have 3 areas of light. You have the direct light, right? So let's say our light source for all of these forms that I just drew is right here. So if it's right here, basically what we're trying to figure out is what angle is the light coming at, and what is that going to do to these objects, what parts of it are getting hit by light, and what parts are not. So for instance, we're getting light coming straight at this cylinder. We'll pretend this is forward in space, so this is getting hit by direct light as well. And we'll do the same thing for the cone. Actually, no, we'll say the cone is slightly behind the sphere, right? And this is part of what light and shadow actually do for you communication-wise. They tell you how things relate to each other in space. They give you more ability to add detail to that sort of thing. And then we've got light coming down here on this prism, right? Cubic prism, square prism, whatever. So let's take a quick look at how light is going to interact with all these things. Let's start with the cubic prism, because that's the simplest thing to deal with. Whenever you're dealing with cubes, the formula for how light interacts with them is pretty straightforward. One surface is going to be hit with direct light and is going to be the brightest. One will be getting hit with some light, but not as much because it's at an angle. And one side is not getting hit with any light at all. So we'll start with the darkest one. And keep in mind what I just said is kind of a formula. It's a gross simplification of how light actually works. There's no such thing as an area that's never getting hit by light. So, for instance, don't ever shade things black, because nothing ever looks like that, and so your brain gets confused. So we've got one side that we're going to call the darkest. It's getting the least amount of light of the 3. And then we've got another area that's getting some light, but not a lot. So it's going to have a higher value, right? And really, when we're talking about shading, we're talking about value, which refers to the differences in the amount of light that are that's hitting any given part of a thing. So studying value, looking up resources for that, is going to be where you'll want to practice. You'll want to hit up some of that material. Psychra, again, has a really cool, he calls it the value game. He has a cool little procedure that you can practice, like a kind of game situation, that I personally have not done because I don't do much shading, but I suspect is probably quite helpful. So I'll recommend you try it out. So as you can see, we've got 3 distinct values. We have 3 different shades of gray, or tints of gray, or whatever you want to call that. There's probably a right name for it, but I don't know what it is. And now that we've done that, this looks like a 3-dimensional form, right? If we take this back off, it seems kind of flat. Like, we can imagine, especially because we've seen the shading, we can imagine what it's supposed to be, but could you tell me which one of these forms is closer to the viewer or farther away? No, right? There's no way to tell. So again, shading is about putting things in space. So like I said, when it comes to figure drawing, if that's what you're into, you don't do a lot of shading because you're dealing with one form, and you usually just shade in places where you want to really make it obvious that 2 forms are separate, right? So like, let's say the sphere down here is part of a head, or it is the head, and then we have a neck that's coming down from it. We really want to say that these 2 things are separate. So what we might do is, take this off real quick. We might say to our viewer, so this head comes out away from this neck, and we're going to explain that by putting a shadow right here. Because what that says to somebody who looks at this is that this thing is closer to the light source. right? And this thing below it is far enough away, right, or moved far enough back that the light as it comes downward is striking the sphere before it can hit this cylinder, right? And you'll notice that I'm basically only talking about geometry. There's a reason for that. All the great masters of art basically have determined that the geometry is the thing that people can think about, right? 3D objects are things that people can process, things like spheres and cubes and, you know, cones. Realistically, obviously, none of these things exist in nature, but they're the closest approximation that our brains can handle. So the concept is, if you can learn to, you know, shade a sphere correctly, right? Like if you can tell me how light should play across the sphere, then when you come across something that's largely sphere-like, you should be able to, in theory, get the shading close enough to correct that you can tell, you know, you can explain to me, the viewer of your art, what the hell I'm looking at. So, just for shits and giggles, I'm gonna blend this shit down slightly. So this is by no means a perfectly shaded sphere, but it's a decent approximation, and that's what we're going for. If I take the line work off, you know, you could still maybe guess what that was if I cleaned it up a little bit. That's another thing about shading too. You don't think about it in terms of lines, but actually lines are really important. You start getting into the realm of painting when you start thinking like that, where you're not explicitly defining an edge with a black line, but the edges still exist and they're still as important. So that's something to keep in mind as well. It's all about communication at the end of the day. So as I clean up this edge, that vision of a sphere that I mentioned, I think will come forth more, and it'll become more obvious that I'm describing a sphere and not a mess of weird color, right? So let's go back to our other example and finish that. The theory on rounded surfaces goes something like this. With a cylinder, there's one point on the cylinder at which light is no longer going to be touching it, and that's a very distinct point. So let's draw another cylinder and imagine that it's coming towards us with one end, right? It's heavily foreshortened. And let's say our light is coming from the left again. There's a point on a cylinder at which you know, it's touching here, and it's touching here, and it's touching here, and it's touching here, and here, and right down the center of the thing is the highest point, right? Because it's a curve, right? Past this line, it starts to go back down, away from the light in this case. So when you're shading a cylinder, you typically think about it as having a line at which the shadow starts, and the left side of that line, right, in this case, is the highest point on that cylinder. Then you have, you know, shadow all along this side, and the shadow is mostly going to be affected by what surrounds it, what other light sources are in the shot. So if we only think about having exactly one light source in the image coming from this side, this would be about the extent of that that shading. I might blend it a little bit because the surface is not perfect, and whoops, you know, I might say the shadow starts here, but it doesn't really quite get 100% dark until slightly after that, right? But that's essentially what's going to happen. And then this front side here is slightly different as well. It's going to have a shading of its own. Again, like this cubic prism situation. In this case, it's not really getting any light. Or if it is, it's getting it at a particular angle. So these two shadings would probably agree. Of course, we typically don't think about a situation in which there's purely one light source. So to be more clear, we would probably say this is either a lighter shade or a darker shade than whatever's happening on the side, because that makes it more obvious what's going on. And I think you would agree with that. So there's that. Let's go ahead and power through the rest of this. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself for a second while I do this, and then I'll come back to you and we'll talk about it. Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I had to get some M&Ms. Okay. So let's talk about this real quick. You'll notice this doesn't look quite right. Can anyone take a guess for me why that is? You tell me. The cylinder looks harsh. What do you mean by that? Okay, yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, the shading on it is not quite smooth, and we would sort of expect that with a rounded surface. Okay, what else? Okay. Do you have any specifics on that, or just kind of a feeling? Okay, so the half sphere is weird. Yep. What else? Nothing else? Okay. Those are all valid points. The weird shading on the sphere, or on the cylinder even, makes it look almost more flat because we have weird lights in the back and some darks in the middle. Like, what's going on here? It's not consistent. It's not even. On the half sphere, the values don't match up with anything else, do they? Right? And on the cylinder, there's some weird stuff going on too. Specifically, I think that the value is not quite right, especially compared to this. So the issue is that we're imagining all these things within the same space, right? The same image, and they're not consistent at all, right? But what if I do this? What if I take any one of these and block them out so that we just have one left? That by itself, does that look as weird as it did before? I don't think so either. No, I think it looks more acceptable because we understand the shorthand of what's being done here. Those flaws that were making it look really flat before are not as bad when it's by itself. If we add everything back in, we see how it flattens right away. Let's do the same thing with the sphere, right? Not so bad by itself. We can still, again, understand what's supposed to be happening here. It doesn't look right, but it's also not unreadable. And we'll keep going to the cone. Same thing here, that it looks more 3D as soon as you take away everything else. And the reason I'm pointing all this out is because shading is all about consistency. Within value, within the actual shading itself, right? How it's done. If your shading is inconsistent, it will always look wrong, even when you're not doing things terribly. So do yourself a favor and make sure that if you're doing a lot of shading within a piece, that you are staying consistent. How you do that? I'll open up another image and we'll figure it out together. This would be a study that I have done quite some time ago, so it's going to take me a while to find it. But essentially what I did was took a photograph of some geometric solids, some forms, and tried to copy it the best I could. That's got to be in here somewhere. Oh man, if I can't find it, I'm going to be mad. Value study. There it is. Uh-oh. Opening canvas failed. I think I'm just trying to do too much on a very, very sad little rig. Oh no. What? Is that just totally broken? Is that not going to work? That's so frustrating. It gets most of the way and then it just stops. No! Crap. What a bummer. Okay. Because I actually was really proud of that too. Ah, dude. All right, well, let's see. I'm sure I have some other value studies we can look at. I've got this guy. That might be useful. I really wanted that one because it's got several different forms all together in the same space. I wonder if I can open this with something else. I'm really sorry, guys. That's an absolute shame. Well, if anyone's got any other sort of questions in the meantime, feel free to throw them out while I'm messing around with this crap. Okay, go ahead, Rena. Yeah, so I use Paint Tool Sai is what it's called. It's a Japanese-made program. I like it because it's cheap and it's got a lot of features that I find really helpful. The main one being the stabilizer feature. So you'll see if I turn that off and try to draw like a straight line. Whoops, I'm gonna do that. It's really wiggly and weird. And that's just because the technology involved in registering strokes on computers is not very good on some of these tablets. So I like it sort of smooths out my lines quite a bit. And you can actually bump it up really high. So when I want to do inking, for instance, I want to like approximate inking to do heavy outlines. It's actually really, it lags behind where my pen is and really smooths out my stroke so that I can make these really smooth, thick lines that look very nice, even though it's basically impossible otherwise. So that's my recommendation. I've had it across several platforms, and I'm currently running it on a Linux machine, so that's another benefit. I don't know what Photoshop or some of those other programs are like, but personally, I imagine there's probably some issues of cross-compatibility. Okay. Yeah, it looks like I'm still having some issues with this guy, which is a bummer, but we'll talk about this sphere. What do you guys notice about it? I know that's a kind of a generic question, but go ahead and take a stab. What do you mean? So you say solid. Try to describe that more. What about it feels solid? Does it have like a density? Does it feel like it's something you could pick up and touch? Okay, cool. Why do you think that is? Different tones of gray. Okay, so can you try to be more specific? What about those tones do you think is doing that for you? Consistent. Okay. What else? How about the fact that it's got a cast shadow there on the surface? Okay, I think that probably helps a lot. Let's look at this piece now. Tell me, what about this, do you think? How does it compare with the other one? Yeah, it's got a different background so it can kind of stand out some more, right? What do you think, though? Does this feel more solid or less than the other one? More solid? Do you have a guess as why do you think that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think you're onto something about the shading. I think it's the color that makes the difference here. Let's try something. Let's try to add a layer on top of this and throw down some color. Just put down some color on this guy and then do that. What do we think about this now? Does this feel more solid or less with the color on? A lot more. So I think part of the reason color makes things more solid like that is that when you're looking at grays, right? First of all, it's kind of unnatural and weird, right? Like you said clay, but how often do you really look at clay or things like it that have that unique sort of strange texture to it? Part of the coloring that you'll notice on the other sphere, let's look at the highlight, right? And separate these colors out. So we've got that sort of light peachy thing going on here. And actually, let me add some white so that we can actually have something to look at to compare these two. Or better yet, let's do a mid-tone gray, because that's actually how you're going to get a more accurate sense of the value of something, right? And value is a part of color. It can have a light and a dark, just like grays do. So we've got that color there in the highlight. Over here towards the middle, we've got this. On this side, we've got a yet darker. And there we go. More of that, more of that. Go all the way down here. And then finally we'll grab some from the shadow. So I'm going to zoom in on this. And these little color swatches here. What can you tell me about them just by looking at them? What do you notice about these colors in the progression, right? Just by looking at them as these little swatches. They get darker, right. Anything else you can pick out? That's okay. So part of what this exercise was for me was attempting to use saturation and color shifting as part of my shading. So what I was attempting to do in this piece was not only get darker with my color, because if you look at this, if we take our light color and then we go over to the color picker and we just go straight down, right? Because this vertical axis is basically light to dark. And we just go downward a step at a time, but we try to stay on that same level of saturation. You see how these colors are differing quite a bit. So part of what's happening here with this change in color is a purposeful difference between saturation and value. What we see here is value, right? We're going from a light value to a dark value. Let's try the same thing again with a difference in saturation only. So I'll take this initial color and I'm just going to go right with it because again the right axis is for saturation. So I'm going to take little steps since I don't have as much real estate. But I'm going to try and do the same thing step by step. And we're just increasing the saturation. Now I realize as I'm saying this is sort of a digital concept. It applies to all painting, but specifically the use of the color picker here is really easy to think about in terms of digital. So if you want to talk about it more in terms of traditional, let me know and I'll do my best. But so you can see, I'll just label these real quick. But we have value and we have saturation here. And these both differ from the actual swatches. So let's take a look then at the color picker itself. Let's see if I can pull up a bigger version of it. Or if I can maybe pull this out. I don't think I can with this program, which is a shame because that would be really nice. But, oh well. We'll do our best. So if you can, try to look at what's happening to the color picker as I go down the list of the swatches. So I start, it's right there in the upper middle of our selector. And when we pick the next swatch, did you guys see which direction it went? It's probably pretty hard to make out, so if not, that's okay, just let me know. Well, since we're working with that delay, I'll just go ahead and talk about it because it's probably going to be really hard to tell. And I don't want everybody to have to wait on it. So when I pick this first swatch, we're right up in the very top in the middle. When I pick the next one, what we see is an increase in the saturation and a decrease, I guess, in the value, right? The value gets darker. And we get more saturation than we do value, right? We're increasing the saturation about twice as much as we are the value. If we go to the next one, same thing. We're almost going in a straight diagonal towards the right side center of our square. We're approaching this all the way to the right, where we're just halfway between light and dark and all the way saturated, right? That's the trend. We pick the next one, it's the same thing, it's just a smaller step. And then we pick another one, we get towards a purple, you'll notice, right? Especially when we look at that shadow, it starts to become almost sort of a purple, like a lavender even. That is where the color shift comes in. And as I keep going through the swatches, the shading jumps around a little bit. So it starts, instead of that straight trend, it actually gets lighter in value at one point. And the value decreases a lot less, and we actually desaturate when we get to the shadow slightly. And that, I think, was meant to communicate when I was doing this, that there was sort of a reflected light coming back in. But I'm pointing all of this out to show you that when you're first learning shading and you're working with sort of this grayscale stuff, I found that to be really difficult. And I've got a huge number of pieces of me just trying to figure this stuff out, trying to figure out light to dark, white to black, grayscale stuff. And I don't know that that's a bad thing, that I struggled with that for a while. But I will say that once I started working with color shifting, all of this stuff became a lot easier. So what I would recommend if you're going to try and get into shading is go ahead and understand what is value. Try to understand what is saturation. Why are they different? Why do we use them, right? How do they tie into the physics of light? Because ultimately we are trying to depict light, and understanding how light works is kind of necessary. So you're going to need to learn a little bit of physics, unfortunately. And then keep in mind that color makes a huge difference when it comes to communicating about light, because color is a part of light. If you guys like, I can try to explain some of the physics of light and how it ties into this stuff. But if not, that can be a subject for another time. Okay, yeah, that's kind of a big topic in and of itself too. So, all right, so we've talked about a lot of stuff. I think I will probably go ahead and end it here unless there's any other quick questions we want to tag. And I will attempt to get that other file pulled up because I think it's a really good demonstration of what I was talking about earlier with the lights and darks being consistent and that making the big difference for shading. If not, that's okay. No more? Okay. Well, thank you guys again for showing up, and I hope this was helpful. If not, I would be happy to try to clarify or point you to a better teacher. But until then,